On the 4th of March, in the year 1918, in the soft midday heat of the early Caribbean spring, the second largest ship in the United States Navy got underway from the harbor of Bridgetown in Barbados in a clear sky and a gentle wind, and steamed north into the Atlantic in the direction of Baltimore, with a hold full of manganese ore and 306 men aboard her. She never arrived. She did not send a distress call. She did not, so far as the closest searching could determine, leave a single piece of herself behind on the ocean. No oar, no spar, no lifebelt, no floating cap, no body, and no oil slick, and no wreckage that could ever be identified as having come from her. She was, by some considerable margin, the largest object that had ever in the modern world simply ceased to be there. She had been there in Bridgetown in the morning. By the 2nd of April, when she should have been entering the Chesapeake, she was not. In the 107 years that have passed since then, the United States Navy has at intervals reopened the file, and oceanographers and naval engineers and a great many less responsible parties have written about her, and a name has been attached to the patch of sea on which she did her vanishing, and that name has been attached to several other vanishings that have happened on that water since, and a kind of theory of the place has accreted around the original loss. But the ship herself has never been found. The men have never been found. The hold of manganese ore, which weighed 10,800 tons, has never been found. It is, in the strictest sense the words can be used, an empty file. What can be said about her, with reasonable confidence, fills perhaps a long evening's reading. What is not known, what the sea has kept, and seems to mean to keep, is the entire heart of the affair. This is a story without a body to bury, and without an answer to give. The thing it can offer, instead, is a clear account of what we do know, set against the long silence that surrounds it. She was the USS Cyclops, hull designation AC-4. She had been built in 1909 at the Cramp Shipyard in Philadelphia, and commissioned the following year, and she belonged to a class of ships called Proteus-class colliers, vessels whose only military purpose was to carry coal across long distances for the use of the fleet, and which therefore needed to be very large, very capacious, and not much else. She was 542 feet long, weighed 19,000 tons at full load, and could carry 11,000 tons of cargo. The next largest ship in the Navy, in the year 1918, was the battleship Pennsylvania. After her, the Cyclops. She was an ugly ship. She looked, to the eye of any sailor of the period, like a steel barn that had been set on top of a hull. She had two strange angular gantries running across her deck on each side. These were for swinging coal in and out of her holds with bucket conveyors, and they made her look, in profile, like nothing else in any navy. The official photographs of her are slightly comical. She did her work. She had crossed the Atlantic many times, carrying coal between the eastern seaboard and the ships of the European fleet. And she had carried small numbers of passengers when needed. And she had a record of being slow and homely and entirely reliable. The war had been on when she sailed from Bridgetown for 3 years and 8 months from the European point of view, and for 11 months from the American. The Atlantic was full of German submarines. Convoys had been instituted. American shipping in the central and southern Atlantic was on alert for the kind of small grey conning towers that meant a torpedo was already in the water, somewhere astern. The Cyclops was not in a convoy. The Navy had decided that her route between Barbados and the Chesapeake was at that moment of the war a safe enough lane to be run alone. She had no escort. She had no destroyer. She had of her own 4 small 4-inch guns and a crew that had been trained to use them. Beyond that, she had the size of her, which is a defense of a kind, and the speed of her, which was modest, and a captain, about whom we shall now have to say a great deal. He had been born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in a small German village called Sandstedt near Bremen in the year 1862. He had gone to sea as a boy. He had come to the United States in his early 20s and had taken American citizenship under a name that better suited the country he had come to, George Washington Worley. He had served in the American Merchant Marine for a quarter of a century. He had been given command of the Cyclops in 1908, when she was still under Navy Auxiliary Command, and had stayed with her, off and on, for 10 years. By the time she sailed from Barbados that March, he had captained her, as he afterward would put it in conversation, longer than he had been married to either of his wives. He was, by every account that has reached us, a difficult man. The crew called him, on his own ship, the damned Dutchman, in the language of the period that did not distinguish between Dutchmen and Germans. He drank. He had been seen drunk on the bridge. He had been the subject of 2 formal complaints by his junior officers, and 1 by a passenger. He had survived all 3. He was tyrannical in the older style. He believed in cuffing seamen, in saying things to officers in front of their juniors that no commanding officer should have said, and in running his ship the way that a certain kind of 19th century captain had run sail-driven merchantmen, which was to say as a private kingdom of one. He was tolerated because he was good with the ship, which he understood very deeply, and because in an era when colliers were not the prize commands and good men were not always available for them, he was who the Navy had. The war did not improve any of this. The war, in fact, raised a question that had not been salient before. The question was the question of where his loyalties lay. He had been born German. He had family in Germany. He had been heard, in the years before America entered the war, to speak with sympathy of the German cause. None of this is the same thing as treason, and none of it was ever, by any inquiry that examined it, demonstrated to be more than the natural ambivalence of a man whose old country and new country had ended up on opposite sides of a war he had not chosen for either of them. But it had been noticed. It would be noticed, very particularly, when the Cyclops did not arrive at Baltimore. Conrad would have understood Worley in a way most men of his time could not. Conrad was himself a man of doubled origins, a Polish boy who became an English sea captain, who became an English novelist, and he wrote, all his life, about men whose loyalties had been left by accidents of geography and history, in places their flags no longer flew over. Worley was such a man. He had become, by every legal measure, what an American captain is supposed to be. But the country he had come from had crossed over in the calendar of empires and put him on a flag he had outgrown, but not entirely outrun. He was, in the language of the novel that had not yet been written about him, a Lord Jim of the coaling fleet. He had spent his whole American life, very probably, in some private chamber of his own head, settling the question of which country he belonged to. The war had come along and re-asked the question in front of everybody. This is not a defense of him. It is not an accusation either. It is the man as he was. He was a hard captain, of foreign origin, with a known fondness for drink and a known temper, in command of an enormous slow ship full of valuable cargo and 300 souls. In the middle of a war, his country and his country were on opposite sides of. The Navy knew all of this when they sent him out from Barbados. They sent him anyway. He was, all things considered, the man they had. She was carrying manganese ore, 10,800 tons of it, loaded at the Brazilian port of Rio de Janeiro in the previous month, and a number of passengers. The passengers were not the kind a peacetime collier ordinarily had on her. There was the American Consul General at Rio, Alfred Gottschalk, who was returning home. There were 2 American mining engineers. There were 3 United States Marine officers. And there were 5 United States Navy sailors who were under arrest on charges of mutiny against another vessel and were being brought home for court-martial with their own Marine guard. There were also, by the manifest, 2 civilian passengers about whom the manifest is unhelpfully terse. The total head count, including the Cyclops' regular crew of 280-odd, came to 306 souls. The manganese ore is worth dwelling on. Manganese, in 1918, was a war metal of the first importance. It was the additive that turned ordinary steel into the hard steel of armor plating and gun barrels. And the United States was importing it as fast as the holds of its ships could carry it. The Brazilian deposits were the richest in the Western Hemisphere. The Cyclops had been built for coal, but could carry anything that would lie still in her holds. And the Navy had been using her for the last 6 months on the Rio run. She was, when she sailed from Bridgetown, riding low in the water. She was riding lower, in point of fact, than her own captain afterward was said to have liked. Worley had complained at Bridgetown that she was overloaded. He had complained that one of her starboard engines was misfiring and could not be safely run at full pressure for the 8 days of the journey north. He had asked in writing to be allowed to wait for repairs and a partial offloading. His request, signed by the local Navy commander on the spot, had been declined on grounds of wartime urgency. He had been told to sail. He had sailed. The last contact anyone in Bridgetown had with the Cyclops was on the morning of the 4th of March, when her tender came back from a final water run and the harbour master gave her clearance to leave. She steamed slowly out past the breakwater. The watch on Pelican Island reported her hull was indeed riding very low. The watch on the Bridgetown light reported her stack still visible at 3 in the afternoon, and not visible at sunset, by which she would have been by then beyond the horizon and well into the open Atlantic, on a course roughly due north. After sunset, the Cyclops, like all ships, became the responsibility of her own captain. She did not arrive. The arrival date the Navy had calculated, 8 days at her usual cruising speed, was the morning of the 13th of March. The morning of the 13th came. The Chesapeake was empty. The Navy waited. They waited the next day, and the next. They raised her on no radio frequency. They made inquiries at every port they could think of in case she had had to put into harbour. She had not. On the 14th of April, 6 weeks after she had sailed, the Department of the Navy issued the formal announcement that the USS Cyclops had been lost. The search that had begun in the previous weeks and continued for months found nothing. Nothing is the operative word, and is worth being precise about. Not a board of her, not a hat, not a bucket, not an oar. No body washed up on any beach in the West Indies, or on the Carolinas, or on the Florida coast. No lifeboat was ever recovered. The 4 small lifeboats of the Cyclops were, like the ship herself, gone. The submarine logs of the German Navy, opened to inspection after the war, recorded no engagement with a vessel of her description on any date that could have been hers. The U-boats of 1918, in any event, had not been operating that far west of the European coast in any number. Weather records from ships in roughly the same patch of ocean in the relevant week showed weather perfectly ordinary for the season. There was no storm. There had not even been a particularly bad day. She had simply not come home. What followed, over the next century, was the long Conradian afterlife of an absence. A theory grew up, in stages, that the ship had been the victim of something to do with the patch of sea she had sailed across. It was noticed, in particular, that several other vessels had vanished in roughly the same triangle of water between Bermuda, Miami, and San Juan, and that the records of these vanishings, taken together, suggested something more than chance. A man named Vincent Gaddis, writing in Argosy magazine in 1964, coined for the area the phrase by which it has been known ever since, the Bermuda Triangle. He listed the Cyclops as the founding case. He explained, with the cheerful confidence of a magazine writer in 1964, that the disappearances in the triangle were probably the result of some natural force, perhaps magnetic, perhaps geophysical, perhaps not yet named, that was peculiar to that water. He sold a great many magazines. He sold a great many subsequent books. The triangle became a small industry. Several of the other vanishings he listed have, in the decades since, turned out to have ordinary explanations. The Cyclops has not. The other theory that grew up, contemporaneous with the loss, was that Worley had done something. The damned Dutchman had defected. He had run the ship into a German port. He had mutinied with German sympathizers among the crew and surrendered her. He had scuttled her in the middle of the Atlantic and was now living, under some other name, in Sandstedt or Hamburg. The Navy investigated. The German records, opened after 1918, contained no mention of any such defection. The relatives of crewmen offered evidence that several officers had quarrelled with Worley in the days before sailing and might have mutinied themselves once at sea. None of this is impossible. None of it is supportable. None of the men in question were ever heard from again, on either side of any sea. The third theory, slow to emerge but in the end the most persuasive, was structural. Two of the Cyclops' 3 sister ships in the Proteus-class colliers, the Proteus and the Nereus, were both lost in 1941 in roughly the same patch of ocean, both carrying heavy mineral cargoes of bauxite, both also without wreckage. By the time naval engineers in the 1970s and 80s looked carefully at the design, the answer began to compose itself. The colliers had a particular weakness in the longitudinal bracing of their main deck girders. Under the unusual stress of heavy mineral ore, much denser and much more punishing to the hull than the coal the ships had been built for, the girders could and did fail. A failure of that kind, if it happened in the wrong condition of sea, would mean the ship breaking in half, not slowly, but in a span of seconds, with no time for any kind of signal. The water in those seconds would close over her, and the men in her, and the cargo in her, and the air would simply reform, and there would have been nothing left. This is, on the available evidence, what most likely happened. It does not, of course, prove anything. It is a probable account of why no wreckage was ever found, which is that the ship went straight down in deep water with the iron of her hull and the manganese of her cargo holding her down past any depth at which the sea would later cough up wood and life jackets onto the beaches. It does not tell us why. It does not tell us at what hour. It does not tell us whether Worley, in the moment in which the deck cracked beneath him, was sober. It does not tell us what the 305 other men in her did. It is a quiet engineering answer, of the kind men in offices supply for things that have happened far from offices. The case remains officially open. The US Navy's Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships still classifies the Cyclops as presumed lost, cause unknown. The file is not closed. Once a year or so, some piece of metal pulled up by a fisherman off the Carolinas, or some sonar echo on the floor of the tongue of the ocean, briefly raises the possibility that she has been found. None of these, so far, has been her. She is somewhere down there. Statistically, the most likely location for her is in the deep water east of the Bahamas, in a region of seabed 2.5 miles below the surface, which has been imaged in patches but never comprehensively. If the engineering theory is right, she lies in 1,000 pieces under that water, with 306 men's bones scattered among them, and 10,000 tons of manganese ore distributed around the wreckage in such a way that any submersible passing low over it would not necessarily recognize what it was looking at as a single object. She is in the dark. The pressure that holds her there is enormous. The fish that swim above her have no idea what she is. We have, at this point, very little idea what she is either, except that she is the Cyclops and was somewhere about. Here, lost. Joseph Conrad had only 4 years to live when she went down and was finishing a novel that had begun in the trenches of his own thinking some years before. He had spent his life writing about the men who go down with ships and about the sea that does not, in any literal way, mourn them. He never wrote about the Cyclops. He died in 1924. He would, if he had lived a little longer, have written something about her. Not, I think, about Worley's German origin, which the lesser papers of 1918 had made too much of, but about the silence afterward. The silence is what Conrad understood. He had been at sea long enough to know it. He understood that the ocean is not a witness. He understood that the only witnesses are the men on the ships, and that when the ships go down, the witnesses go with them, and that the case, after that, is what we make of it from the harbour. What we have made of the Cyclops is what Conrad would have predicted. We named the patch of water she vanished in. We attached a small mythology to it. We accommodated the missing ship inside a larger pattern of missing ships, which is the way the human mind, faced with an absence, prefers to deal with it. We have, in the 107 years since, in our quieter moments, occasionally remembered that there are 306 specific men inside that mythology who were on a ship coming home from Brazil with a hold full of war metal, and one of whom was a difficult, tyrannical German-born captain in the bad late middle of his life, and another of whom was an American diplomat returning to see his wife, and several of whom were Marines under arrest, and most of whom were ordinary sailors who had drawn the watch on the wrong vessel that month. They all went under together. Whatever they thought, in the last seconds, went under with them. The water above them that afternoon is the same water that is over them now. The triangle is still there. The ships still cross it. They cross it now in convoy and out of convoy, in war and in peace. on instruments that would have astonished the chief navigator of the Cyclops. And most of them get to the other side of it without incident, because most ships, in most weather, on most days, do. But every now and then, one of them does not. And when one of them does not, somebody, somewhere, will say what one of the harbour men at Bridgetown said when the news came in on the 14th of April in 1918 that the Cyclops was overdue and would not be coming home. He said, "The Triangle has taken another one." He said it before the Triangle had been given a name. He understood what was in front of him without needing a name for it. The sea was a place where ships sometimes did not come back. The names we put on it, afterward, were our names. The thing that the names attempted to describe had been there longer than the names. And the Cyclops lies somewhere in it, 2 miles deep, in the dark, and the cold, and the silence, with everyone who was on board her still at their stations. The sea, in its own way, is not in a hurry to give any of them back.